Every parent knows the quiet desperation of working 3 jobs just to give your child a better life. Ezekiel Morrow understood this burden better than most, scraping together coins each day in Dubai's financial district, dreaming of his daughter's college graduation. One morning, he accidentally blocked the convoy of billionaire developer Farid Al-Nasir. The wealthy man stepped out, furious, and began shouting Arabic insults, assuming this poor black father wouldn't understand. But when Zeke responded in perfect ancient Arabic poetry about wisdom and humility, the entire street fell silent. How does a maintenance worker know the sacred verses of Sufi masters? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's harsh buzz cut through the pre-dawn silence of the cramped studio apartment in Karama, jolting Ezekiel Morrow from restless sleep. At 62, his body protested the early hour with familiar aches in his lower back and shoulders. The accumulated weight of decades spent lifting, cleaning and repairing what others left behind. He rolled quietly from the narrow bed, careful not to wake Maya, who slept peacefully on the small couch they'd converted into her makeshift bedroom with carefully arranged cushions and a thin privacy curtain. The apartment's single window faced east, and through the thin glass, he could see the first hints of orange bleeding across Dubai's sprawling skyline. The gleaming towers of the financial district rose like silver sentinels in the distance, their glass facades catching and reflecting the early light in brilliant fragments. It was beautiful, in its way, this city of impossible dreams built from desert sand and human ambition. But beauty, Zeke had learned long ago, was often cold comfort when you lived in its shadows. He moved through his morning routine with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that every moment mattered. The tiny kitchenette barely accommodated his lean frame as he prepared instant coffee in a chipped ceramic mug. A wedding gift from nearly 40 years ago, one of the few precious things he'd managed to hold on to through all the moves and struggles that followed Sarah's passing 3 years earlier. The faded photograph tucked behind the coffee canister caught the morning light, and Zeke paused, as he did every morning, to study the faces looking back at him. There he was, decades younger, sitting cross-legged on colorful rugs in a library that smelled of ancient leather and frankincense. The Sufi masters who had welcomed him into their circle during his university years smiled with the serene confidence of men who had found peace in surrender to something greater than themselves. Professor Al-Hakim, his primary teacher, sat beside him with weathered hands, resting on an ornate Quran, the same copy that now lay hidden beneath folded clothes in Zeke's dresser drawer. Those had been different times, when his mind was hungry for wisdom rather than worn down by worry, when he could spend entire nights discussing the mysteries of existence rather than calculating whether they had enough money for both groceries and Maya's textbooks. He'd been Ezekiel Morrison then, a young African-American scholar fascinated by the intersection of Islamic philosophy and African oral traditions, pursuing graduate studies in comparative religion with dreams of becoming a professor himself. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Sarah, brilliant, beautiful Sarah, with her infectious laugh and fierce determination, had needed a husband more than the world needed another philosopher. When she became pregnant with Maya during his final semester, the choice had seemed clear. Love, he'd reasoned, was itself a form of worship, and providing for his family was a sacred duty that transcended academic pursuits. He'd left his studies unfinished and never looked back, not even when Sarah would find him late at night, still reading by lamplight and whisper, "You could still go back, you know. Finish what you started." He'd always kissed her forehead and told her he had everything he needed right here, and he'd meant it, every word. Now, 38 years later, their daughter Maya was finishing what he'd begun in her own way. Pre-med at the American University of Sharjah, top of her class, and already accepted to medical school. The acceptance letter, crisp, official, and bearing news that made his chest swell with pride, was carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve on the small table they used for dining. Every morning he glanced at it and remembered why the ache in his back and the calluses on his hands were worth enduring. The financial reality was sobering, but not insurmountable. Medical school in the United States would cost nearly $200,000 over 4 years. His savings, accumulated through relentless discipline over the past 3 years, amounted to $37,000, a respectable sum that represented countless 12-hour days and skipped meals. But, still far short of what Maya needed, he had 3 steady jobs that kept food on the table and rent paid with a little left over. Monday through Wednesday, he cleaned offices in the Jumeirah Lakes Towers complex, arriving before dawn to empty trash bins, mop floors, and wipe down conference tables where deals worth millions were struck by men who never noticed the quiet black man keeping their world spotless. Thursday through Saturday, he worked maintenance at a luxury hotel in Marina, fixing leaky faucets and replacing air filters for guests who spent more on a single night's stay than he earned in a month. Sundays, he did odd jobs around the Emirates. Hills neighborhood, gardening, painting, small repairs for expatriate families who paid well for reliable help. It was honest work, and Zeke found dignity in it even when others didn't. Sarah had taught him that there was no shame in any labor performed with integrity and purpose. God sees the heart, she used to say, not the job description. The coffee was bitter but strong, and Zeke savored the few quiet moments before Maya stirred. She was so much like her mother, determined, brilliant, and burdened with a sense of responsibility that sometimes seemed too heavy for her 23-year-old shoulders. Last week, she'd suggested dropping out of pre-med and finding work to help support them both. The conversation had lasted exactly 30 seconds before Zeke's gentle but firm refusal ended any further discussion. "Your mama and I didn't sacrifice, so you could sacrifice too," he told her. "Some dreams are too important to negotiate with." Across the city, in a glass tower that scraped the belly of heaven itself, Farid Al-Nasir was also beginning his day, though his morning routine bore little resemblance to Zeke's quiet preparations. The penthouse suite of Al-Nasir Tower commanded views of both the Persian Gulf and the sprawling desert beyond, a testament to the empire he'd built through 2 decades of shrewd investments and ruthless business practices. At 58, Farid moved through his marble and chrome domain with the confident stride of a man accustomed to having the world bend to his will. His personal chef had prepared a breakfast of fresh dates, Arabic coffee, and perfectly prepared shakshuka, served on bone china that cost more than most people's monthly salary. The morning's business reports were already arranged on his desk, color-coded tabs marking the most critical developments in his vast portfolio of hotels, shopping centers, and residential developments throughout the Gulf region. Yet for all his success, Farid Al-Nasir was a man increasingly isolated by his own achievements. His wife Amira had returned to London 3 months ago, ostensibly to oversee their son Khalil's final year at Cambridge, but really to escape the growing coldness that had settled over their marriage like dust over an abandoned room. Their phone calls had become perfunctory exchanges about logistics and finances, carefully avoiding the deeper issues that neither seemed willing or able to address. Khalil, their only child, was 25 and brilliant in his own right, but their relationship had grown strained over the years. Where Farid saw practical necessity, Khalil saw moral compromise. Where Khalil advocated for social responsibility, Farid perceived naive idealism that would be corrected by experience. Their last conversation had ended with harsh words about a low-income housing project that Farid had blocked, and they hadn't spoken since. The irony wasn't lost on Farid that he'd worked so hard to build a legacy for his family that he'd somehow lost the family itself in the process. Success, he was learning, could be its own form of poverty. His assistant knocked softly before entering with the day's schedule. 3 board meetings, a conference call with investors in Abu Dhabi, and the afternoon groundbreaking ceremony for his latest project, a luxury residential complex in Jumeirah that would displace several older buildings but generate substantial returns for his development company. It was, by any measure, a successful life. He owned properties on 3 continents, employed hundreds of people, and wielded influence that extended from the highest levels of government to the most exclusive social circles. His name appeared regularly in business publications, usually accompanied by words like visionary, dynamic, and transformational. But lately, in the quiet moments between meetings and deals, Farid found himself wondering what his own father would think of the man he'd become. The elder Al-Nasir had been a modest merchant who'd built a small but respected business through honest dealings and genuine concern for his community. He died when Farid was 30, proud of his son's early successes, but worried about his growing ambition. Wealth is a tool, his father had often said, but some men become tools of their wealth instead. Don't let money become your master, my son. The advice seemed quaint now, a relic from simpler times, when business moved at a more human pace, and success was measured in community standing rather than quarterly earnings. The modern world demanded a different kind of ruthlessness, a willingness to make difficult decisions that softer hearts might avoid. As his driver prepared the convoy of luxury vehicles that would transport him through the city, Farid reviewed his phone messages. Most were routine business matters, but one caught his attention, a text from Khalil, the first communication in weeks. Saw the news about the Jumeirah project. Some things matter more than money, Dad. I hope you remember that. The message stung more than Farid cared to admit, partly because it echoed his father's old warnings, and partly because he suspected Khalil might be right. But sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when shareholders expected results and competitors circled like hungry wolves. The Jumeirah development would proceed as planned, regardless of his son's objections or his own occasional doubts. The city was awakening as both men prepared for the day that would change everything. In the narrow streets of Karama, Zeke kissed Maya's forehead as she slept, whispered a quiet prayer for her continued blessings, and stepped into the humid morning air with his worn prayer beads, a gift from Professor Al-Hakim decades ago, tucked safely in his pocket. In the rarefied heights of Al-Nasir Tower, Farid settled into the leather seats of his armored Mercedes, surrounded by security and insulated from the world he sought to reshape. Neither man knew that in a few hours their paths would cross in, a moment that would strip away all pretense and reveal the deeper truths that bind humanity together, truths about fatherhood, faith, and the courage it takes to choose wisdom over pride when the whole world is watching. The morning heat had already begun to shimmer off the asphalt by 9 o'clock when Zeke arrived at his first job site in the heart of Dubai's financial district. The Emirates towers cast long shadows across Sheikh Zayed Road, providing brief respites of coolness for the workers and pedestrians navigating the bustling thoroughfare. Traffic moved in its typical rhythm, aggressive but somehow orderly, like a complex dance choreographed by necessity and impatience. Zeke had worked this route for nearly 2 years, and he knew its patterns the way a musician knows a familiar song. The morning rush brought executives in their German luxury cars, construction crews in battered pickup trucks, and service workers like himself on foot or crowded into aging buses. Everyone had their place in the city's elaborate hierarchy, and most were content to stay in their assigned lanes. He was wheeling his cleaning cart across the plaza toward the office complex when he noticed the elderly woman struggling with her shopping bags near the intersection. Mrs. Fatima was a regular sight in the neighborhood, a retired teacher in her 70s who lived alone in one of the older apartment buildings and often ventured out early to avoid the worst of the heat. Today, she seemed particularly frail, weighed down by groceries that looked too heavy for her slight frame. Without hesitation, Zeke changed course toward her, guided by the simple principle Sarah had instilled in him. When you see someone in need, you help. It wasn't a complicated philosophy, but it had shaped decades of small kindnesses that rippled outward in ways he rarely got to see. "Assalamu alaikum, Mrs. Fatima," he said gently in Arabic, approaching with the respectful demeanor he learned during his years of study. "May I help you with those bags?" The old woman's face brightened with recognition and relief. "Wa alaikum assalam, Mr. Ezekiel. You are always so kind. Yes, these are heavier than I thought." As Zeke bent to lift the bags, he heard the low rumble of approaching engines, multiple vehicles moving in formation with the unmistakable authority of wealth and power. He glanced up to see a convoy of 3 black Mercedes sedans approaching the intersection, led by a vehicle with tinted windows and followed by what appeared to be security escorts. The timing was unfortunate. In helping Mrs. Fatima toward the sidewalk, Zeke and his cleaning cart had wandered into the street just as the convoy approached. The lead driver, clearly not expecting pedestrians to interrupt the carefully planned route, was forced to brake sharply, causing a minor traffic disruption as other vehicles swerved to avoid the sudden stop. Zeke immediately recognized his error and began pushing the cart toward the curb as quickly as possible, but the damage was done. The convoy's smooth progress had been interrupted, and in a city where time meant money and inconvenience was rarely tolerated, such disruptions carried consequences. The rear door of the lead Mercedes opened with aggressive force, and out stepped a man whose very presence seemed to command the attention of everyone within 50 yards. Farid Al-Nasir was not particularly tall, but he carried himself with the kind of authority that made physical dimensions irrelevant. His perfectly tailored suit probably cost more than Zeke earned in 6 months, and his expression conveyed the barely contained fury of someone unaccustomed to having his plans disrupted by anyone, especially someone he would consider beneath his notice. "What is this nonsense?" Farid barked in English, his voice carrying across the intersection with enough volume to stop conversations and turn heads. "Do you have any idea whose time you're wasting?" Zeke had positioned himself protectively near Mrs. Fatima, who had shrunk back against a nearby wall, clearly frightened by the sudden commotion. He kept his voice calm and respectful as he responded, "I apologize, sir. I was just helping this elderly lady with her groceries. I'll move out of your way immediately." But Farid was not in a mood for reasonable discourse. The morning had already brought news of construction delays on 2 projects, a problematic inspection report that could cost millions to rectify, and the lingering sting of his son's critical text message. This minor traffic disruption became the focus for frustrations that had been building for weeks. "Do you think this is your personal sidewalk?" Farid continued, his voice rising as a small crowd began to gather. Several people had already pulled out their phones, sensing that something dramatic was unfolding. "Do you think important people should wait while you play helper to every beggar on the street?" The word beggar struck Zeke like a physical blow. Not because it wounded his pride, but because Mrs. Fatima flinched as if she'd been slapped. In that moment, something shifted in Zeke's demeanor. His posture straightened slightly, and those who knew him well would have recognized the quiet dignity that emerged when his principles were challenged. "Sir," Zeke said evenly, "I meant no disrespect. The lady needed assistance, and I provided it. Surely you can understand." "I understand," Farid interrupted, switching to rapid Arabic in the assumption that this would allow him to express his contempt more freely. "That ignorant people like you think the world revolves around your petty problems. You have no education, no understanding of how things work, no appreciation for the responsibilities of those who actually build something in this world." The Arabic flowed from Farid's tongue like acid, classical phrases mixed with colloquial insults designed to humiliate and dismiss. He spoke of Zeke's obvious ignorance, his presumption in thinking he could inconvenience his betters, his pathetic existence as a servant who should know his place. The words were chosen carefully to sting, delivered with the confidence of someone who assumed his target would understand none of the nuances and all of the contempt. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the spectacle of wealth confronting poverty. In broad daylight, phone cameras captured every moment, already uploading the confrontation to social media platforms where such encounters could go viral within minutes. Some onlookers seemed uncomfortable with Farid's harsh tone, while others watched with the fascination reserved for public drama. Mrs. Fatima pressed herself further against the wall, tears beginning to form in her eyes as she understood every word of Farid's tirade. Other Arabic speakers in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the cruelty in the businessman's choice of language. Zeke stood quietly throughout the verbal assault, his face impassive but his hand unconsciously touching the prayer beads. In his pocket, those ancient wooden spheres that carried the weight of decades and the wisdom of teachers who had understood that true strength came not from striking back, but from remaining centered in the face of injustice. When Farid finally paused to catch his breath, seemingly satisfied that he had put this inferior person firmly in his place, Zeke stepped forward slightly. His voice, when he spoke, was soft, but carried with surprising clarity across the plaza. "In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful," he began in Arabic so pure and classical that several people in the crowd caught their breath. "The believer is not one who eats his fill while his neighbor goes hungry, and he is not a believer whose neighbor does not feel safe from his harm." The effect was immediate and profound. Farid's confident expression faltered as he realized that not only had this man understood every insult, but was responding in Arabic more eloquent and sophisticated than his own. Zeke continued, his words flowing like poetry from some deeper well of knowledge. "As the great Al-Ghazali taught, remember often the destroyer of pleasures, death. For in that moment when we stand before the Almighty, we will not be judged by the height of our towers or the weight of our gold, but by the kindness we showed to those who could do nothing for us in return." The plaza had fallen completely silent, except for the distant hum of traffic. Even the wind seemed to pause as Zeke's words settled over the gathering crowd like morning dew on desert flowers. "Wealth is a test, brother," Zeke said gently, using the Arabic word aki that implied both kinship and respect. "The question is not whether we pass or fail that test, but whether we remember, in our abundance, the boy we once were who needed help carrying his books home from school." Farid stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, his entire worldview tilting on its axis. This was impossible. A maintenance worker quoting Sufi philosophers and Islamic scholars with the fluency of a seminary graduate, speaking with compassion to a man who had just publicly humiliated him. The crowd remained motionless, sensing they had witnessed something extraordinary, but not yet understanding its full significance. Phone cameras continued recording, capturing not just the words, but the profound shift in energy that had transformed a moment of ugliness into something approaching grace. Zeke helped Mrs. Fatima gather her bags, nodded respectfully to the stunned businessman, and quietly wheeled his cart toward the office building where his actual work awaited. As he walked away, his prayer beads clicking softly in his pocket, he left behind a plaza full of people who would spend the rest of the day trying to understand what they had just experienced. Behind him, Farid Al-Nasir stood beside his luxury convoy, surrounded by wealth and power and security, yet feeling more exposed and uncertain than he had in decades. By noon, the video had been viewed over 50,000 times. Zeke first learned about his sudden internet fame when Maya called during his lunch break. Her voice a mixture of pride and concern that reminded him so much of Sarah, it made his chest tighten. "Dad, you need to see this," she said without preamble. "Someone filmed what happened this morning and posted it online. It's everywhere." Zeke sat on the concrete steps behind the office building, unwrapping the simple sandwich he'd prepared. That morning, peanut butter and local bread, the same lunch he'd eaten for the past 3 years because it was filling, inexpensive, and required no refrigeration. Around him, other workers chatted in a dozen different languages, creating the familiar polyglot symphony of Dubai's service industry. "I don't understand," he said into his phone. "What's everywhere?" "The video of you talking to that businessman. Dad, do you know who that was? Farid Al-Nasir, he's worth billions. And what you said to him, people are calling it beautiful. They're saying you gave him a lesson in humanity he'll never forget." Through the phone screen, Maya showed him the footage that someone had captured and posted to social media. The video was surprisingly clear, picking up not just the visual drama of the confrontation, but also the audio quality that allowed viewers to understand both Farid's harsh Arabic tirade and Zeke's gentle, profound response. The comments section had exploded with reactions in multiple languages. English speakers praised the dignity of Zeke's response. Arabic speakers marveled at the depth of his knowledge and the beauty of his classical pronunciation. Many users had shared the video with their own commentary, adding context about the quotes he'd used and the significance of his approach. "This is what real wisdom looks like," one comment read. He could have responded with anger, but chose education instead. Another user had posted, "I've been studying Arabic for years, and I barely understood half of what this man said." Where did he learn to speak like a scholar? But not all the attention was positive. Within hours, the video had also attracted the usual contingent of internet trolls and cynics. Some questioned whether the encounter was staged. Others made crude comments about Zeke's appearance or economic status, and a few defended Farid's right to be angry about the traffic disruption. More concerning were the phone calls that began reaching Zeke's supervisors at his various jobs. 2 came from representatives claiming to work for Al-Nasir's company, inquiring about the background and employment status of the man who had harassed their employer that morning. The language was carefully neutral, but the implication was clear. There could be consequences for this public embarrassment. Mr. Hassan, the facility manager at the office complex where Zeke worked most days, called him aside during the afternoon shift. Hassan was a fair man who had always treated his employees with respect, but his expression was troubled as they spoke in the parking garage away from other workers. "Ezekiel, my friend, we need to talk," Hassan said, in the gentle tone he reserved for difficult conversations. "I've received some calls about this morning. Important people are not happy about the attention this video is bringing." Zeke nodded calmly, having expected this moment since Maya's phone call. "I understand, sir. I never intended for this to become public." "I know you didn't, and between you and me, I watched the video. What you did, helping that old woman, speaking with dignity even when you were being insulted, that's the kind of man I want working for me." Hassan paused, choosing his words carefully. "But I also have bosses and contracts with big companies. They're suggesting that perhaps it would be better for everyone if you found other employment." The words hung in the air between them like a suspended sentence. Zeke had worked for Hassan for 2 years, had never missed a day or received a single complaint, had even stayed late without extra pay when special events required additional cleaning. But none of that mattered when powerful people felt their dignity had been challenged. "How long do I have?" Zeke asked simply. "Through the end of the week," Hassan replied, and there was genuine regret in his voice. "I'm sorry, my friend. This is not fair, but fairness is a luxury I cannot afford." The news hit Maya harder than it did Zeke. When he returned to their small apartment that evening, he found her pacing the narrow space between the kitchenette and her makeshift bed, her medical school acceptance letter clutched in her hands. Like a talisman. "This is my fault," she said as soon as he walked through the door. "If I wasn't so expensive, the school fees, the books, all of it, you could afford to lose one job. You could tell them all to go to hell." "Maya," Zeke said, gently settling into his usual chair and opening his arms to her. She collapsed into the embrace like she had as a child, and he felt the weight of her fears and frustrations in the tension of her shoulders. Your education is not a burden, baby girl. It's the whole point. Your mama and I didn't struggle so. You could feel guilty about having dreams. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set through their single window. The glass towers in the distance glowed like golden monuments to ambition, beautiful and remote as distant stars. "Dad," Maya said eventually, "how do you know all that stuff? The Arabic, the quotes, all of it? I mean, I knew you were smart, but what you said to that man, it was like listening to a professor." Zeke was quiet for a long moment, his fingers absently working the prayer beads in his pocket. It had been years since anyone had asked about his past, and longer still since he'd felt inclined to share it. "Before I met your mother," he began slowly, "I was a different person. Younger, obviously, but also more focused on myself. I thought knowledge was something you collected, like trophies on a shelf." He told her about Professor Al-Hakim and the small group of scholars who had welcomed a curious young American into their circle. He described the long evenings spent in discussion, the texts they'd studied together, the gradual understanding that wisdom was not about accumulating information, but about learning to see the divine spark in every human encounter. "Why did you give it up?" Maya asked. "I didn't give it up," Zeke replied. "I just found a different way to practice it. Raising you, providing for our family, helping people like Mrs. Fatima, that's all worship too. Sometimes the most profound scholarship happens outside the classroom." As they talked, neither of them noticed the black sedan parked across the street, or the figure in the back seat who had been watching their building for the past hour. Farid Al-Nasir sat in his car, staring up at the lighted window of the modest apartment, trying to reconcile the man he had insulted that morning with the glimpse of another life he was beginning to understand. His own phone had been buzzing all day with calls from his PR team, business associates, and board members. The video had reached their circles too, and the reaction was not uniformly supportive. Several prominent families had called to express their disapproval of his public behavior. His wife, Amira, had sent a terse text from London. "Khalil showed me the video. We need to talk." Most painful was the message from his son. "Is this who you've become, Dad? Is this what you want people to remember about our family?" Sitting in his luxury car outside Zeke's humble apartment building, surrounded by all the markers of his success, Farid Al-Nasir felt poorer than he had since childhood. The leather-bound journal lay open on Zeke's small dining table, its pages yellowed with age and filled with handwriting that had evolved over decades of late-night reflections. Maya sat across from him, her own notebook ready as her father shared stories she had never heard before. "I started writing in this during my second year of graduate studies," Zeke explained, his fingers tracing the worn cover with obvious affection. "Professor Al-Hakim said that wisdom was like water. If you didn't give it a place to flow, it would stagnate and be lost." The journal contained fragments of conversations with Sufi masters, copied passages from texts that had moved him, and his own attempts to synthesize Islamic philosophy with the African oral traditions he had grown up hearing from his grandmother. There were prayers written in Arabic, English, and sometimes a mixture of both, creating a personal spiritual language that bridged worlds. "Listen to this," Zeke said, turning to an entry from 40 years earlier. "Tonight, Professor Al-Hakim told us about the difference between ilm and hikmah, knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge, he said, is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is not putting it in a fruit salad." Zeke chuckled at his younger self's attempt to capture profound concepts in simple metaphors. Maya laughed, despite her anxiety about their current situation. "Did you always want to be a scholar?" "I thought I did," Zeke replied, turning the pages slowly. "But your mother changed everything. Not because she asked me to, she never would have done that, but because loving her taught me something the books couldn't. He found the page he was looking for and read aloud. Sarah makes me understand that the greatest jihad, the greatest struggle, is not against external enemies, but against the selfishness inside our own hearts. When I watch her care for her sick grandmother, when I see her sacrifice her own comfort for others, I realize that she is practicing a form of worship I never learned in any classroom. She was sick. Grandma Grace? Maya asked. She had only vague memories of her grandmother who had died when Maya was very young. Dementia, Zeke said quietly. Your mother spent 2 years feeding her, bathing her, reading to her even when Grace no longer recognized her own daughter. I wanted to help pay for professional care, but Sarah insisted on doing it herself. She changed my diapers when I was helpless, she said. Now it's my turn. The memory brought tears to both their eyes. Sarah had possessed that rare combination of intellectual brilliance and practical compassion that made her equally comfortable discussing philosophy and changing bedpans. She had been working toward her own master's degree in social work when Maya was conceived, and had deferred her dreams with the same grace she brought to every sacrifice. The night you were born, Zeke continued, I was sitting in the hospital, waiting room, terrified and excited and completely overwhelmed. I opened this journal and wrote something that I've read probably 1,000 times since. He found the entry, written in the rushed handwriting of a man trying to capture a moment before it escaped. Today I held my daughter for the first time. She is so small, so perfect, so completely dependent on us for everything. In that moment, I understood what the prophet meant when he said that paradise lies beneath the feet of mothers. But I also understood my own role, to be the kind of man she can be proud of, to live in such a way that she never has to choose between loving me and respecting herself. Maya wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Is that why you never went back to school? For me? For us, Zeke corrected gently. For the family we were building together. I made a choice, baby girl, and I've never regretted it. Not for 1 minute. While father and daughter shared stories and memories in their modest apartment, Farid Al-Nasir was conducting his own form of research from the mahogany-paneled office of his private investigator. The file on his desk contained more information about Ezekiel Morrow than Zeke himself might have remembered. The investigator, a discreet British man named Crawford, who specialized in background checks for high-net-worth individuals, had worked with impressive speed. Within 24 hours, he had assembled a comprehensive profile that painted a picture dramatically different from Farid's initial assumptions. Your maintenance worker, Crawford said in his clipped accent, is actually quite remarkable. Born in Detroit to a working-class family, full academic scholarship to Wayne State University, graduated magna cum laude with a double major in religious studies and African American literature. Went on to graduate studies at Georgetown, where he specialized in comparative Islamic philosophy. Farid studied the photocopied academic transcripts with growing amazement. Zeke's grades were consistently excellent, and his thesis topic, Synthesis of Sufi Mysticism and African Oral Wisdom Traditions, suggested a mind capable of sophisticated analysis. He never finished? Farid asked. Left in his final semester, to marry Sarah Williams, a social work student from Howard University. No indication of academic problems or financial difficulty. All evidence suggests he left voluntarily. Crawford turned the page. There are letters of recommendation here from some very distinguished professors. Listen to this one. Mr. Morrison possesses that rare combination of intellectual rigor and spiritual sensitivity that would make him an exceptional teacher. His ability to find connections between seemingly disparate philosophical traditions suggests a mind that naturally seeks unity rather than division. The file contained photographs from Zeke's university years. A young man with bright eyes and an eager smile, sitting among robed scholars in what appeared to be the library of a mosque. The contrast with the tired maintenance worker Farid had encountered was stark, but somehow also revealing. The essential dignity was the same, as was the quality of attention he brought to every interaction. "What about his current situation?" Farid asked. Crawford's expression grew more serious. "Widowed 3 years ago. Wife died of cancer after a long illness. Significant medical bills depleted their savings. Works multiple jobs to support his daughter's education. She's in pre-med at AUS. Excellent student. By all accounts, he's devoted his entire adult life to his family." The investigator closed the file with a soft thud. "There's more, sir. Since yesterday's incident, he's already lost 1 job. Word is spreading through the service industry networks. Some of your business associates have been making calls." Farid felt an unexpected stab of guilt. He had not explicitly ordered any retaliation, but in Dubai's tightly connected business community, his displeasure could have consequences that rippled far beyond his direct control. And the daughter, Maya Morrow, 23, pre-med student, Dean's List every semester, just accepted to medical school in the States, Johns Hopkins, full admission but no scholarship. The tuition alone will cost nearly $200,000 over 4 years. The numbers hit Farid with unexpected force. He spent more than that on a single business lunch, yet for the Morrow family it represented an impossible mountain of debt that would require years of sacrifice to climb. As Crawford left with his fee, an amount that could have covered Maya's first semester, Farid found himself alone with information that complicated his understanding of the morning's encounter. This was not the simple narrative of an ignorant worker overstepping his bounds. This was something far more complex, and if he was honest with himself, more humbling. His phone buzzed with another message from Khalil. "Dad, I've been thinking about our last conversation. Maybe we should talk when I get home next month. There are things I want to understand about the choices you've made." For the first time in years, Farid wasn't sure he had good answers to give his son. The world had seemed so clear when it was divided into those who succeeded and those who failed, those who understood how things worked and those who got in the way. But Ezekiel Morrow fit none of those categories. He was educated but worked as a laborer, brilliant but content with anonymity, poor in money but rich in something Farid was beginning to recognize as more valuable. That evening, as Dubai's lights painted the sky in shades of gold and amber, 2 fathers sat with their children, sharing stories that revealed the depths beneath their surface lives. In one apartment, the sharing brought them closer together. In the other, it opened questions that had been locked away for too long. The viral video continued to spread across social media platforms, viewed now by hundreds of thousands of people around the world. Most saw it as a simple story of dignity, triumphing over arrogance, but for the 2 men at its center, it had become something more complicated, a mirror that reflected back truths they weren't sure they were ready to face. The envelope arrived by private courier at 7 in the morning, 3 days after the video had reached over 1 million views. Zeke was preparing for another day of job searching when the knock came at their apartment door, a sharp professional rap that suggested official business. The courier, a young Pakistani man in a crisp uniform, asked for identification before handing over the thick manila envelope bearing the letterhead of Al-Nasir Development Corporation. Inside, printed on heavy cream-colored paper, was a formal settlement offer accompanied by a confidentiality agreement that ran to 12 single-spaced pages. Maya read the documents first, her pre-med training having given her experience with complex legal language. Her hands trembled slightly as she processed the numbers. "Dad," she said quietly, "they're offering you $100,000. The sum was staggering in their context. More money than Zeke had ever seen at one time, enough to cover Maya's first 2 years of medical school, with money left over for living expenses. The offer was carefully constructed to appear generous while serving the company's interests. In exchange for the payment, Zeke would agree never to discuss the incident publicly, remove any social media posts related to the encounter, and sign a statement saying that any perceived conflict had been a simple misunderstanding between 2 reasonable men. "There's more," Maya continued, scanning the fine print. "They're also offering you a position, facilities management supervisor for their residential properties. Salary of 60,000 dirhams per month, full benefits, housing allowance." The job offer was genuinely attractive, triple what Zeke currently earned from his various positions, with the kind of security and respect that had eluded him for years. It would solve their immediate financial problems and provide a stable foundation for Maya's future. Most people in their situation would have signed without hesitation, but as Zeke read through the documents, he felt a familiar weight in his chest. The same heaviness he'd experienced years earlier when a potential employer had asked him to omit his mosque volunteer work from his resume, or when a landlord had suggested that certain neighbors might be more comfortable if he kept his prayer schedule private. These were the small compromises that accumulated over a lifetime, each one reasonable in isolation, but collectively adding up to something that felt like a betrayal of essential principles. "What do you think?" Maya asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. Before Zeke could respond, his phone rang. Hassan, his former supervisor from the office complex, was calling with news that several other employers in the district had received similar inquiries about Zeke's background and current availability. "It's strange, my friend," Hassan said. "Usually when someone is blacklisted, it happens quietly, but this feels different. Like someone is making sure you can't find work anywhere in the city." The implication was clear. Accept the offer or face the prospect of unemployment in an economy where reputation mattered more than qualifications. Maya watched her father's face as he absorbed this information. She had inherited Sarah's ability to read his expressions, and she could see the conflict playing out behind his eyes. This wasn't just about money or jobs, it was about the kind of man he chose to be when the pressure was greatest. "Dad," she said carefully, "maybe this is a blessing. I mean, the money would solve everything. And if taking it means I can become a doctor without you having to work yourself to death." She let the sentence hang unfinished, but they both understood what she wasn't saying. She loved him enough to want him to compromise his principles if it meant a better life for both of them. It was the kind of loving sacrifice that Sarah might have made, and it broke Zeke's heart, even as it filled him with pride. Across the city, Farid was having his own difficult conversation with his son. Khalil had returned from London unexpectedly, claiming he needed to discuss something urgent with his father. They sat in Farid's office as the morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. "I saw what you did," Khalil said without preamble. He was 25, but looked older, his face carrying the weight of disappointments that had accumulated over years of watching his father's transformation from the man who had once taught him about honor and compassion. "I assume you mean the settlement offer," Farid replied, swiveling his chair to face the windows rather than meet his son's gaze. "It's a reasonable solution to an unfortunate situation." "Reasonable?" Khalil's voice carried an edge that reminded Farid uncomfortably of his own father's rare moments of anger. "You publicly humiliate a man who was helping an elderly woman, then you try to silence him with money. How is that reasonable?" The question hung between them like a sword. Farid had built his empire by making difficult decisions quickly and moving on without second-guessing himself. But this situation felt different, more personal, and somehow more consequential than the usual business conflicts he navigated. "The man embarrassed me in front of cameras," Farid said finally. "In this business, reputation is everything. I can't afford to appear weak." "And what about his reputation?" Khalil countered. "What about his right to help people without being insulted and threatened? What about basic human decency?" Farid turned back to face his son, seeing in Khalil's expression a combination of love and disappointment that struck him like a physical blow. This was his child, the boy he had taught to ride bicycles and solve math problems, the young man he had hoped would someday take over the family business. When had their relationship become this minefield of unspoken resentments and moral disagreements? "You think I'm a bad man," Farid said quietly. "I think you've forgotten who you used to be," Khalil replied. "I remember when I was little, you used to tell me stories about Grandpa Omar, how he would give free goods to families who couldn't pay, how he treated every customer like family. You said that's what business should be, a way to serve the community, not exploit it." The memory was sharp and painful. Farid's father had indeed operated his small business with those principles, and he had died respected and beloved by everyone who knew him. But he had also died with modest savings and a small shop, leaving his family comfortable but not wealthy. "The world changed," Farid said. "Your grandfather's approach wouldn't survive in today's economy." "Maybe," Khalil said. "Or maybe you just decided it was easier to ignore your conscience than to find creative ways to honor it." As his son left the office, Farid found himself alone with questions he hadn't considered in years. Success had insulated him from many forms of discomfort, but it couldn't protect him from the growing sense that something essential had been lost along the way. Something that the man in the video had managed to preserve, despite poverty, loss, and public humiliation. In their respective spaces, both men faced the same fundamental choice, whether to take the path that seemed safest and most profitable, or to risk everything on the uncertain hope that doing the right thing might lead somewhere better than they could imagine. The childhood drawing was taped to the inside of Zeke's dresser drawer, faded but carefully preserved between sheets of tissue paper. Maya had created it when she was 7 years old, using crayons to depict herself in a white coat with a stethoscope. Around her neck, standing next to stick figures labeled Daddy and Mama, with Dr. Maya written in uneven letters across the top. Sarah had found it so charming that she'd wanted to frame it immediately, but Zeke had suggested they keep it somewhere safe instead. "Dreams are fragile when they're young," he'd said. "Sometimes they grow better in private until they're strong enough for the world to see." Now, 24 hours after receiving the settlement offer, Zeke held the drawing in his weathered hands while Maya slept on the couch nearby. The little girl who had drawn this picture had become a brilliant young woman on the verge of fulfilling her childhood ambition. The money being offered could make that dream a certainty rather than a struggle. He'd spent the day in prayer and reflection, seeking guidance from the same sources of wisdom that had sustained him through Sarah's illness and death. The Quran lay open on his small table, turned to verses about patience and trust in divine providence. His worn journal contained new entries, questions, and doubts written in the careful handwriting of a man trying to navigate between practical necessity and spiritual principle. "Oh Allah," he wrote, "help me to see the difference between prudent caution and cowardly compromise. Show me how to provide for my daughter without betraying the values Sarah and I tried to live by." The internal debate had been raging for hours. The rational arguments in favor of accepting the offer were compelling. Maya's future would be secure, they would have financial stability for the first time in years, and refusing might mean years of continued struggle with no guarantee of success. Who was he to let pride endanger his daughter's dreams? But every time he reached for the pen to sign the documents, he heard Sarah's voice from one of their last conversations. She had been weak from chemotherapy, but her mind was still sharp as she talked about the legacy they wanted to leave Maya. "I don't want her to remember us as people who were defeated by hardship," Sarah had whispered. "I want her to remember that we chose hope, even when hope was expensive." The memory brought fresh tears to Zeke's eyes. Sarah had refused pain medication that might have clouded her thinking during their final weeks together, insisting she wanted to be fully present. For every moment they had left, she had faced death with the same quiet courage she'd brought to every challenge in their life together. Would accepting this money honor her memory or diminish it? His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Mr. Morrow, this is Farid Al-Nasir. Could we meet? I have something important to discuss with you." The message was unexpected and intriguing. Zeke had learned from the viral video's comments that Farid had a son studying abroad, but he hadn't anticipated direct contact from the young man. Meanwhile, in the penthouse of Al-Nasir Tower, Farid was experiencing his own sleepless night of reflection. The conversation with Khalil had stirred up memories he'd been avoiding for years, recollections of his father Omar and the principles that had once guided the family business. He remembered being 12 years old, working in his father's shop during school holidays, watching how Omar treated each customer with genuine interest and respect. There had been the elderly woman who couldn't afford medicine for her husband. Omar had quietly arranged for her to pay, with cleaning services that he didn't actually need. There was the young father who had lost his job. Omar had offered him work and dignity rather than charity. Business is about relationships, not transactions, Omar had often said. Money is just how we keep score, but the game is really about whether we make the world a little better or a little worse. Farid had internalized those lessons during his youth, but somewhere along the path to enormous success, he had convinced himself that his father's approach was naively idealistic. The modern world demanded harder choices, sharper edges, a willingness to prioritize results over relationships. But watching the video of his encounter with Zeke had forced him to confront an uncomfortable question. What would his father think of the man he had become? The business empire he'd built was impressive by any measure, but it had been constructed through a series of compromises that had gradually eroded his connection to the values Omar had taught him. He had justified each decision as necessary for success, but collectively they had transformed him into someone his younger self might not recognize. His wife Amira's departure to London hadn't been sudden. It had been the culmination of years of growing distance as Farid became increasingly absorbed in business at the expense of family relationships. Their conversations had become functional rather than intimate, focused on schedules and logistics rather than dreams and feelings. Khalil's criticism stung because it was accurate. The son he had hoped to impress with his achievements instead saw them as evidence of moral compromise. The respect he commanded in business circles came at the cost of losing respect from the people who mattered most. The settlement offer he'd made to Zeke was designed to solve the problem efficiently, eliminate the embarrassment, prevent further public scrutiny, and return to business as usual. But it was also, he was beginning to realize, exactly the kind of solution that had been gradually corrupting his character for years. Rather than addressing the real issue, his own behavior, and the attitudes that had led to it, he was trying to purchase silence and continue unchanged. It was the approach of a man who saw problems as obstacles to be overcome, rather than opportunities to grow. As the night wore on, both men wrestled with choices that would define not just their immediate futures, but their fundamental identities. In the modest apartment in Karama, Zeke prayed for the wisdom to distinguish between genuine humility and false pride. In the luxury penthouse overlooking the Gulf, Farid confronted the possibility that true success might require abandoning everything he thought he knew about winning. The dawn call to prayer echoed across the city as both men reached their separate decisions, neither knowing that their choices would soon bring them together in ways that would transform both their lives forever. Dr. Rahman delivered the news with the gentle professionalism that came from 20 years of oncology practice, but his words hit Farid like a physical blow. The manila folder on the mahogany desk contained test results, imaging scans, and medical terminology that added up to a simple, devastating reality: pancreatic cancer stage 3, with a prognosis measured in months rather than years. "I want to emphasize that this is not a death sentence," Dr. Rahman said carefully. "We have treatment options that can extend and improve quality of life significantly. But I also believe in giving my patients complete honesty about what we're facing." Farid sat in the leather chair across from the doctor's desk, his usual commanding presence diminished by the fluorescent lighting and antiseptic smell of the private medical clinic. For a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his environment, the randomness of disease was particularly cruel. All his wealth, influence, and careful planning meant nothing against the cellular rebellion happening inside his own body. How long? He asked simply. With aggressive treatment, we're typically looking at 12 to 18 months. Some patients do better, some... Dr. Rahman let the sentence fade diplomatically. Farid absorbed this information with the same analytical detachment he brought to business crises, but underneath the surface calm, his mind was racing. 18 months to finish everything he'd built, to repair relationships that had deteriorated over years of neglect, to figure out what legacy he actually wanted to leave behind. The irony was not lost on him that this diagnosis came just days after his confrontation with a man who had spoken eloquently about mortality and the true meaning of wealth. Zeke's words about standing before the Almighty echoed in Farid's memory with new and uncomfortable relevance. Across the city, Zeke was making his own momentous decision. He had risen before dawn, performed his morning prayers with extra attention and focus, and then carefully composed a letter that would accompany the unsigned settlement documents he planned to return. The letter was written in his neatest handwriting, on simple paper, but every word had been chosen with the precision of a poet. Mr. Al-Nasir, I am honored by your generous offer, but I must respectfully decline. My daughter Maya has suggested that I am being foolish to refuse such a life-changing opportunity, and perhaps she is right. But I have learned that some things cannot be purchased, and my peace of mind is one of them. I bear you no ill will for our encounter. In fact, I pray that Allah grants you wisdom, health, and the blessing of understanding that true wealth comes not from what we accumulate, but from what we give freely to others. If you ever wish to speak as one father to another, rather than as adversaries in a conflict neither of us chose, I can be reached at the community clinic in Karama most Sunday mornings, where I volunteer to help translate for patients who struggle with English or Arabic. May peace be upon you and your family. Ezekiel Morrow. The letter was delivered by the same courier service that had brought the original offer, creating a symmetry that pleased Zeke's sense of completion. Maya had read it before he sealed the envelope, and while she'd said nothing, he'd seen the mixture of pride and concern in her expression. You know, this might mean we'll struggle for years, she'd said quietly. Baby girl. Zeke had replied. We've been struggling for years already. At least this way, we'll struggle with our dignity intact. The coincidence of their meeting at the community clinic seemed orchestrated by forces beyond human planning. Farid had been directed there by Dr. Rahman, who recommended the facility's excellent patient support services for people dealing with serious diagnoses. The clinic operated on a sliding scale fee structure and employed counselors who specialized in helping patients and families navigate the emotional challenges of terminal illness. Zeke had been volunteering there for over 2 years, using his language skills to help patients communicate with medical staff and his gentle manner to provide comfort to people facing their darkest moments. Sunday mornings found him in the clinic's small waiting room, reading to children while their parents met with doctors, or simply sitting with elderly patients who had no family to accompany them to appointments. When Farid walked through the clinic's modest entrance that Sunday morning, he was dressed simply in khakis and a polo shirt, the first time in years he'd appeared in public without a suit. The change in attire was deliberate, part of his growing understanding that his usual armor of wealth and status might actually impede the conversations he needed to have. He recognized Zeke immediately, despite the different context. The maintenance worker from their viral encounter was sitting beside a young mother, gently translating as she spoke, with a nurse about her son's treatment schedule. Zeke's manner was patient and kind, and Farid could see why people trusted him with their most vulnerable moments. When their eyes met across the waiting room, Both men experienced a moment of recognition that went beyond their previous encounter. There was something different in Farid's expression, a vulnerability that hadn't been present during their street confrontation, and Zeke responded to it with the same gentle attention he brought to all the clinic's patients and families. "Mr. Al-Nasir," Zeke said quietly, approaching after he'd finished helping the young mother, "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "I received your letter," Farid replied, "and I have some things I need to discuss. Perhaps we could speak privately." They found a quiet corner of the clinic's small garden, where patients often came to sit in the sunshine during treatment breaks. The space was simple but peaceful, with flowering bushes and a small fountain that provided soothing background noise for difficult conversations. "First," Farid said, "I want to apologize, not because my lawyers advised it, not because it's good for business, but because I was wrong. Everything about how I treated you was wrong." The apology was delivered with none of the calculated politeness Farid typically employed in business settings. This was raw and genuine, coming from a man who was learning to distinguish between strategic communication and authentic expression. "Your apology is accepted," Zeke said simply. "We all have moments when stress and anger make us less than our best selves." "But it wasn't just a moment," Farid continued. "It was the result of years of becoming someone I don't think I like very much, someone my father wouldn't recognize, someone my son barely respects." They talked for nearly an hour, two fathers sharing stories about their children and their fears for the future. Farid spoke about Khalil's disappointment in his business practices, about his wife's departure, about the growing isolation that had accompanied his financial success. Zeke listened with the same careful attention he brought to his most challenging translation work, occasionally asking gentle questions that helped Farid articulate feelings he'd been avoiding for years. When Farid finally shared his medical diagnosis, the news hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Suddenly, their encounter was no longer about embarrassment or settlements or viral videos. It was about two men facing mortality and wondering what their lives had actually meant. "I've spent my entire adult life building something I thought would last forever," Farid said quietly. "Now I'm realizing that the only things that actually last are the relationships we build and the kindness we show to each other. It's not too late," Zeke replied. "As long as we're breathing, we have opportunities to choose who we want to be." As they sat together in the clinic garden, surrounded by people facing their own health challenges, both men began to understand that their viral encounter had been less a conflict than a collision, two lives intersecting at exactly the moment when both needed to learn something essential about forgiveness, humility, and the courage it takes to change course even when the destination is uncertain. The architectural plans spread across Farid's conference table told a story of transformation that went far beyond building specifications and zoning requirements. What had begun as a standard luxury development project, another gleaming complex, designed to maximize profit margins, had evolved into something unprecedented in his company's history. The original blueprints called for the demolition of 6 older buildings in Karama to make way for high-end condominiums targeting wealthy expatriates. The projected profits were substantial, the market research was favorable, and the city approvals had been secured through the usual combination of proper procedures and strategic relationships. But 3 weeks of conversations with Zeke had changed everything about how Farid understood the project's true implications. Their friendship had developed gradually, built through regular meetings at the community clinic where both men were dealing with their own forms of crisis. Farid's cancer. Treatments had begun in earnest, chemotherapy sessions that left him weak, but somehow also clearer about what mattered most. Between appointments, he'd started joining Zeke in his volunteer work, initially as a way to practice the humility he was trying to learn, but increasingly because he found genuine purpose in helping others navigate difficult circumstances. Working alongside Zeke had given Farid an intimate view of the community that his development project would displace. These weren't abstract statistics or demographic data points. They were families with deep roots, elderly residents who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, small business owners who served as informal community centers for their neighbors. Mrs. Fatima, the elderly woman Zeke had been helping on the morning of their first encounter, lived in one of the buildings marked for demolition. So did Ahmad, the young father who ran a small grocery store on the ground floor of his apartment building, serving customers who spoke 6 different languages and often needed credit to make it through difficult months. There was also the community center where children came after school for tutoring and homework help, and the small mosque where Friday prayers brought together Muslims from across Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East. This isn't just about displacing people, Zeke had said gently during one of their walks through the neighborhood. It's about destroying a network of relationships that took 20 years to build. These folks don't just live here, they belong here. The revelation had forced Farid to confront an uncomfortable truth about his business practices. For years, he had approached development projects as purely financial exercises, calculating costs and returns without seriously considering the human impact of his decisions. The families affected by his projects were abstractions, unfortunate but necessary, casualties of economic progress. But walking through Karama with Zeke, meeting the actual people who would be displaced, hearing their stories and understanding their connections to each other and to the place they called home, had made abstraction impossible. The modified plans now spread across his conference table represented a radical departure from conventional development logic. Instead of luxury condominiums, the project would create mixed-income housing that allowed current residents to remain in upgraded units. The ground-floor commercial spaces would be reserved for existing businesses at subsidized rents. The community center would be rebuilt with expanded facilities, and the mosque would be incorporated into the complex's design with architectural sensitivity to its spiritual function. The financial projections for the revised project were sobering. Profits would be significantly reduced, construction costs would be higher, and the timeline would be extended by at least 18 months. From a purely business perspective, the changes made no sense. From a human perspective, they represented the kind of development that Farid's father, Omar, would have been proud to support. "Are you certain about this?" asked Jennifer Walsh, his chief financial officer, studying the revised numbers with obvious concern. "The board is expecting returns consistent with our usual projects. This is going to be a very difficult presentation." Farid nodded, understanding her concerns, but feeling more certain about this decision than he'd felt about anything in years. "I know it's unconventional, but I think we have an opportunity to prove that profitable development and community benefit don't have to be mutually exclusive." The truth was more complex than his public explanation. The medical diagnosis had given Farid's life an urgency it had never possessed before, and he found himself asking different questions about the legacy he wanted to leave. All his successful projects would eventually be demolished or renovated by future developers, but the relationships he'd damaged and the communities he'd disrupted would have lasting consequences that extended far beyond his lifetime. Maya had been watching her father's transformation with wonder and growing concern. The friendship with Farid had brought unexpected benefits. The billionaire had quietly arranged for Maya to receive a full scholarship to medical school, funded through an educational foundation that bore his father Omar's name. But she could also see the emotional toll that Zeke's volunteer work was taking, particularly his growing involvement with terminal patients at the clinic. "Dad," she said one evening as they shared dinner in their small apartment, "I'm worried about you. You're taking on everyone else's problems as if they were your own." Zeke paused in his reading. He was studying Arabic poetry again for the first time in decades, rediscovering texts that had moved him during his university years. Baby girl, I think I'm finally figuring out what those problems always were. We're all connected in ways that don't show up on organizational charts or property deeds. The observation was characteristic of the philosophical direction his thoughts had taken recently. Watching Farid grapple with mortality had reminded Zeke of his own aging, of the limited time he had left to make a meaningful difference in the world. The job losses that had initially seemed like disasters had actually freed him to pursue the kind of service work that aligned with his deepest values. But what about your own life? Maya pressed. Your own happiness? This is my happiness, Zeke replied gently. Helping people, building bridges between communities, using whatever wisdom I've accumulated to make things a little better for others. That's what gives my life meaning. As the date approached for the public hearing that would determine the fate of the Karama development project, both men found themselves preparing for a confrontation that would test everything they'd learned about courage, community, and the price of moral leadership. Farid knew that presenting the revised plans would likely cost him support from his board of directors, potentially threatening his control over the company he'd spent decades building. But he also knew that his remaining time was too precious to waste on projects that served no purpose beyond enriching people who were already wealthy beyond necessity. Zeke understood that speaking publicly about the development would make him a target for criticism from various quarters. Some would say he was being manipulated by a guilty billionaire. Others would argue that he was standing in the way of economic progress that could benefit the city's growth. But he also knew that his neighbors needed an advocate who understood both their concerns and the broader economic forces they were facing. The community petition had grown to include over 800 signatures from residents, business owners, and supporters throughout the city. Khalil had returned from London to help organize the grassroots campaign, working alongside Maya and other young people who brought energy and social media expertise to the effort. The petition represented more than opposition to a single development project. It was a statement about the kind of city Dubai wanted to become as it continued evolving from desert outpost to global metropolis. The signers were asking fundamental questions about whether growth necessarily required the displacement of existing communities, whether profit margins were more important than preserving the cultural diversity that made neighborhoods like Karama special. As the hearing date approached, both Farid and Zeke spent sleepless nights wondering whether they had the courage to follow through on commitments that would change their lives in ways they couldn't fully predict. They had moved far beyond their original conflict about traffic and dignity. Now they were partners in an effort to prove that business success and social responsibility could coexist, even when powerful interests preferred the simpler logic of maximum profit extraction. The architectural plans spread across Farid's conference table represented more than building specifications. They were a blueprint for the kind of legacy two unlikely friends hoped to leave for their children and their community. The Dubai Municipality building's main auditorium had been transformed into a forum for democracy in action, with hundreds of residents, business leaders, and city officials gathered to debate the future of one small neighborhood that had somehow become a symbol of much larger questions about growth, community, and the soul of the rapidly changing city. Zeke sat in the third row, dressed in his best shirt and tie, the same outfit he'd worn to Maya's high school graduation 3 years earlier. The community petition, now bearing nearly 1,000 signatures, lay folded in his jacket pocket alongside the worn prayer beads that had become his talisman during moments of uncertainty. Around him sat the faces that had become familiar over the past month of organizing. Mrs. Fatima, frail but determined, clutching the hand of her granddaughter who had flown in from Canada to support the effort. Ahmad, the grocer, who had closed his store for the afternoon so he could testify about the importance of affordable commercial space. Families with children who attended the community center's after-school programs. Elderly men who had gathered at the neighborhood mosque for decades. At the front of the room, city officials reviewed folders of documentation while Al-Nasir Development Corporation's legal team arranged their presentation materials with the efficient precision of lawyers. Accustomed to winning, the outcome seemed predetermined. Developers with Farid's resources and political connections rarely lost zoning battles against working-class neighborhoods with limited political influence. But today felt different. The viral video that had brought Zeke and Farid together had also attracted international attention to the hearing. Journalists from several major news outlets sat in the press section, drawn by the unusual story of a billionaire developer and a maintenance worker who had somehow become unlikely allies in reimagining urban development. Maya sat directly behind. Her father, her medical school textbooks temporarily forgotten as she prepared to speak on behalf of the younger generation that would inherit whatever Dubai became. She had spent weeks interviewing neighbors, documenting stories that wouldn't appear in any economic impact study, but captured the human reality of what displacement actually meant. The hearing began with procedural formalities, zoning regulations, environmental assessments, traffic impact studies delivered in the dry language of bureaucracy. But when the public comment period opened, the room's energy shifted dramatically. Mrs. Fatima was the first to approach the microphone, her voice trembling, but her message clear. I came to this neighborhood 40 years ago as a young teacher. I raised my children here, buried my husband from the mosque down the street, watched my neighbors' children grow up and start families of their own. This is not just where I live, this is who I am. Her words were translated into Arabic and English for the diverse audience, but emotion needed no translation. The room fell silent as she continued. I don't understand all the legal papers and financial projections, but I understand that some things cannot be replaced once they are lost. Community is one of those things. Ahmad followed with practical testimony about the economic ecosystem that informal neighborhoods create. My store extends credit to families between paychecks. I cash checks for people without bank accounts. My kids do homework at the tables while I work. The big supermarkets in luxury developments don't do these things. They can't afford to care about individual customers the way small businesses do. One by one, residents shared stories that painted a picture of interdependence and mutual support that had developed organically over decades. The elderly woman who watched children after school while parents worked multiple jobs. The mechanic who repaired cars for reduced rates when times were tough. The informal network of translations, job referrals, and emotional support that helped newcomers establish themselves in a foreign country. When Zeke finally approached the microphone, the room's attention focused with laser intensity. Many people had seen the viral video, but few had heard him speak at length about the deeper principles that guided his thinking. Honorable officials, fellow residents, he began in Arabic, then switched to English. I stand before you not as an expert in urban planning or economic development, but as someone who has learned that the true wealth of any community lies not in the value of its buildings, but in the strength of the connections between the people who call it home. His voice carried the measured cadence of someone who had spent years thinking carefully about the relationship between individual choices and collective well-being. The question before us today is not whether Dubai should grow and prosper. Of course it should. The question is whether that growth must come at the expense of the communities that make this city more than just a collection of impressive buildings. He paused, looking directly at the city officials who would ultimately decide the project's fate. I have had the privilege of working alongside Mr. Farid Al-Nasir in recent weeks, and I can tell you that he has proposed something unprecedented, a development that creates new opportunities while preserving existing community bonds. Some of you may wonder whether such an approach is financially viable. I would ask you to consider whether any other approach is morally viable. As Zeke returned to his seat, Maya felt a surge of pride that brought tears to her eyes. This was her father at his best, not preaching or demanding, but inviting others to consider possibilities they might not have imagined on their own. When Maya stood to speak, her voice carried the confidence of someone who had grown up navigating between worlds, the daughter of a scholar who worked as a laborer, a future doctor who understood both poverty and privilege, a young woman who had inherited her parents' commitment to service while developing her own vision for how that service might evolve. "My name is Maya Morrow," she began, "and I want to talk about what this neighborhood has taught me about medicine." The unexpected connection caught the audience's attention immediately. Maya had prepared for this moment by thinking deeply about the parallels between community health and individual health, between the social conditions that allowed people to thrive and the medical interventions that helped them recover from illness. In medical school, we learned that the best treatment for any condition is often prevention, creating conditions where disease is less likely to develop in the first place. Strong communities work the same way. When people have stable housing, reliable social connections, and access to affordable services, they're less likely to need expensive interventions later. She gestured toward the residents who had already testified. The community you've heard described today didn't happen by accident. It developed because people had time to build relationships, because businesses could afford to serve customers as individuals rather than statistics, because children had safe spaces to play and learn while their parents worked. Maya's voice grew stronger as she found her rhythm. The choice before you today isn't just about one development project. It's about whether Dubai wants to be a city that builds communities or just constructs buildings. Whether we want neighborhoods where children can grow up knowing their neighbors' names, or luxury complexes where residents never interact with anyone outside their economic class. The amended development plan that Farid had prepared represented a compromise that few people in the room had seen before, a profitable project that also strengthened the social fabric it was entering. The revised blueprints included community spaces, affordable housing units, and commercial areas designed to support small businesses rather than replace them. Mr. Al-Nasir has shown us that successful development doesn't require destroying what already works, Maya continued. His revised plan proves that business success and community benefit can coexist when developers are willing to measure profit in more than just financial terms. When Farid finally took the podium, the room fell into the kind of silence reserved for pivotal moments. Many attendees had never seen a billionaire developer speak personally at a public hearing. Such presentations were usually delegated to lawyers and technical experts who could maintain professional distance from the human impact of their projects. But Farid approached the microphone as someone who had been fundamentally changed by the preceding weeks of community engagement. His usual business attire had been replaced by simple slacks and a button-down shirt, and his manner was more conversational than commanding. 6 months ago, he began, I would have presented a very different project to you today. It would have been more profitable, more efficient, and completely indifferent to the lives of the people it displaced. The admission drew murmurs from the audience. Corporate executives rarely acknowledged their own evolution in such public forums, and certainly not in ways that suggested previous projects had been morally deficient. I learned something important from Mr. Ezekiel Morrow, Farid continued, nodding toward Zeke. He taught me that true success isn't measured by how much wealth we can extract from a community, but by how much value we can add to the lives of the people who already call that place home. The revised development plan he presented was unprecedented. in its scope and ambition. Instead of displacing existing residents, it would provide them with upgraded housing at affordable rates. Instead of eliminating small businesses, it would create modern spaces where they could expand and thrive. Instead of destroying community gathering places, it would build new ones that better serve the neighborhood's diverse population. This project will be less profitable than our original plan, Farid acknowledged, but profitability isn't the only measure of success. My father built his business by serving his community, and I want to honor that legacy by showing that modern development can do the same thing on a larger scale. The presentation concluded with an unexpected announcement. Farid Al-Nasir stepped forward to address the audience, representing the third generation of his family's business interests. I want to pledge that our company's future projects will follow the model we're presenting today, Khalil said. Profitable development that strengthens communities rather than displacing them. My generation inherits not just wealth, but responsibility for how that wealth affects the world around us. The room erupted in applause that went on for several minutes. City officials looked at each other with the slightly stunned expressions of people who had expected a routine zoning hearing, and instead witnessed something approaching a civic transformation. When the formal vote was taken, the amended development plan was approved unanimously, but more importantly, the hearing had established a new precedent for community engagement in Dubai's ongoing evolution, proving that growth and compassion weren't mutually exclusive when people were willing to prioritize relationships alongside returns on investment. The graduation photograph captured a moment of joy that seemed to radiate beyond the frame itself. Maya stood in her medical school cap and gown, diploma in hand, surrounded by the people who had made her achievement possible. Zeke beamed with the unmistakable pride of a father who had lived to see his daughter's dreams become reality. Beside them, Farid applauded with genuine warmth, his own son Khalil standing nearby with his arm around his father's shoulders. 18 months had passed since that transformative public hearing, and the Karama Development Project had become a model for community-centered urban planning that attracted visitors from cities around the world. The mixed-income housing had allowed long-time residents to remain in upgraded apartments, while newcomers brought fresh energy to the neighborhood. Small businesses thrived in modern commercial spaces designed to accommodate their specific needs. The expanded community center hosted programs that served children and elderly residents alike, creating intergenerational connections that strengthened the social fabric of the entire area. But the real transformation had been in the relationships between the people whose lives had intersected through a moment of conflict that became a catalyst for growth. Maya's medical school graduation represented the culmination of sacrifices that stretched back generations. The scholarship that had made her education possible bore Omar Al-Nasir's name, but it was funded through a foundation that Farid had established to honor both his father's memory and his friendship with Zeke. The Omar Al-Nasir Educational Foundation now provided full scholarships to promising students from working-class families throughout the Gulf region, with a particular emphasis on supporting young people whose parents had immigrated in search of better opportunities for their children. "Your father would be so proud," Zeke had told Farid during the scholarship ceremony the previous year. "Not just of your success, but of how you've chosen to use that success to lift up others." Farid's cancer treatments had been more successful than his initial prognosis had suggested, giving him additional years to rebuild relationships and redirect his business practices toward the community-centered approach he'd learned from Zeke. The diagnosis had been a wake-up call that transformed his priorities completely, but it was the friendship with Zeke that had shown him practical ways to live out those new priorities. The Al-Nasir Development Corporation had restructured its entire approach to urban planning, incorporating community engagement as a standard. Part of every project from the initial design phase onward, Khalil had returned from London to take an active role in the company, bringing fresh perspectives on sustainable development and social responsibility that complemented his father's hard-won wisdom about the importance of relationships over transactions. "I used to think business was about winning," Farid reflected during Maya's graduation reception. "Now I understand that the best business is about making sure everyone wins." The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Some investors had been skeptical of the community-centered approach, preferring the predictable returns of traditional luxury developments. But the Karama project's success had proven that profitable development and social responsibility could coexist when developers were willing to measure success in terms broader than quarterly earnings. Zeke had found his own new path as well. The job losses that had initially seemed disastrous had actually freed him to pursue work that aligned more closely with his values and training. He now served as the community liaison for several development projects throughout Dubai, helping ensure that residents' voices were heard during the planning process. His background in Islamic philosophy and his practical experience in community organizing made him uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between corporate interests and neighborhood concerns. More importantly, his work had reconnected him with the scholarly interests he had set aside decades earlier. He had begun teaching evening classes in comparative religion at the American University of Sharjah, sharing with a new generation of students the synthesis of wisdom traditions that had guided his own spiritual journey. "Teaching again feels like coming home," he had told Maya. "All those years of practical experience have given me stories and insights I never would have gained if I'd stayed in academia the first time around." The friendship between the two families had deepened beyond their initial connection. Khalil and Maya had discovered shared interests in social justice and community development, often collaborating on projects that brought together young professionals and community activists. Farid's wife Amira had returned from London, drawn back by her husband's transformation and the chance to be part of meaningful work through the family foundation. The viral video that had brought them all together was now studied in business, schools, and conflict resolution programs as an example of how public moments of tension could become opportunities for growth and understanding. But for the people whose lives it had actually changed, the video was just the beginning of a longer story about forgiveness, friendship, and the courage it takes to choose compassion over pride. On the evening of Maya's graduation, the extended family gathered at the community center in Karama for a celebration that included neighbors, friends, and colleagues from throughout Dubai's increasingly interconnected communities. Mrs. Fatima, now in her 80s but still sharp as ever, offered a blessing in Arabic that Zeke translated for the diverse gathering. "She says," Zeke announced with a smile, "that Maya's success belongs to all of us, because we all played a part in making it possible. The shopkeeper who extended credit when money was tight, the teachers who saw her potential, the community that supported her dreams, we are all part of her achievement." As the celebration continued into the evening, Zeke stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The prayer beads in his pocket, those ancient wooden spheres that had carried him through so many difficult moments, felt warm against his fingers as he offered thanks for blessings he could never have imagined when his journey with Farid began. Maya joined him in the garden, still glowing with the happiness of her achievement. "Dad," she said, "I know Mama would be so proud of everything we've accomplished." "She's here with us," Zeke replied, looking up at the stars that shone despite Dubai's bright lights. "Every time we choose love over fear, every time we build bridges instead of walls, every time we remember that we're all part of the same human family, she's here with us." The photograph from that evening would join the collection of precious memories that Zeke preserved carefully. But the real legacy of their transformed relationships would continue growing for generations to come.